When I tell people this story, most of them don't believe me. They think it sounds like something out of a horror movie. Exaggerated, made up, but I swear to you, every detail is true, and it still haunts me to this day. It started about 3 years ago, when I was living in a small apartment complex just outside of town. It wasn't the kind of place where people really got to know each other. Just a few rows of old 2-story buildings tucked behind a strip mall and a gas station. Rent was cheap, and at the time, that was all I cared about. I was in my early 20s, working late nights, and I liked that the neighborhood was usually quiet. I kept to myself, and so did most of the tenants, except for one man, my neighbor. He lived directly across the courtyard from me, in an upstairs unit. He was probably in his late 40s, maybe early 50s. I'd see him sometimes, standing out on his balcony smoking, or just leaning against the railing like he was lost in thought. He wasn't unfriendly, but he wasn't the kind of neighbor who waved hello either. Just neutral, forgettable, or at least that's what I thought at first. Looking back now, I realize that's exactly how predators work. They blend in. They make you think there's nothing unusual about them until it's too late. At the time, I never could have imagined what he was really doing at night, or just how long he had been watching me. For the first few months, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. My life was simple. I worked, came home late, grabbed a quick dinner, and usually stayed up, scrolling on my phone or watching TV until I fell asleep. The apartment wasn't anything special, but it was mine, and it felt safe, or at least it used to. It was in those late hours, around midnight or 1 in the morning, when I started to feel different. It's hard to explain. You know that instinct, that sense in your gut when someone's eyes are on you. I'd be sitting at my desk, typing or lying in bed with the glow of my phone screen lighting my face, and suddenly I'd get that feeling. My skin would prickle, my chest would tighten, like I wasn't alone even though my door was locked and the apartment was quiet. At first I told myself it was just paranoia. I'd been staying up too late, drinking too much caffeine, watching too many creepy videos before bed. My mind was playing tricks on me, or so I thought, but the feeling wouldn't go away. If anything, it kept getting stronger, until I found myself constantly glancing at the window, half expecting to see something there. One night, I finally gave in to that instinct. It was almost 2 a.m., and I was sitting on the edge of my bed when I felt it again. That same heavy sense that I was being watched. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. The curtains were mostly drawn, but a small gap in the fabric gave me a narrow view of the courtyard outside. It was dark and still. Too still, and for just a second, I thought I saw movement. I froze, my eyes locked on that narrow gap between the curtains. At first, I told myself it could have been anything, a branch swaying in the breeze, maybe a stray cat slipping through the shadows. I held my breath, waiting, staring into the darkness. But then it happened again. A shift, a figure. Someone was out there. I pushed the curtain just slightly to the side, careful not to make it obvious, and that's when I saw him, my neighbor, standing across the courtyard at 2 in the morning. He wasn't smoking. He wasn't pacing around. He wasn't doing anything you could explain away. He was just standing there, perfectly still, facing directly toward my window. I felt my stomach drop. I told myself maybe he couldn't actually see me. Maybe it was coincidence. But then, as if to erase all doubt, his head tilted slowly, like he knew I was watching him back, like he was acknowledging me. I yanked the curtain shut and sat there in the dark, my heart pounding so loud it hurt. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there, trying to convince myself it didn't mean what I thought it meant, that maybe he was drunk, or maybe I imagined it all together. But deep down I knew this wasn't random. This wasn't the first time. That was the night I realized my neighbor had been watching me. The next morning I tried to shake it off. I went about my day like nothing happened, convincing myself I was overreacting. People stand outside at night all the time, right? Maybe he just couldn't sleep. Maybe he was just out there, getting some air. But no matter how many excuses I made, I couldn't get the image out of my head. The way he stood there, unmoving, facing directly toward me, that slow tilt of his head, like he wanted me to know. When I got home that evening, I found myself double-checking the locks on my doors and windows. I closed the blinds earlier than usual, made sure there weren't any gaps this time. But even with the curtains drawn tight, I still felt that sensation, that pull, that invisible weight of eyes on me. It's a feeling you can't fake. It crawls under your skin until you can't ignore it anymore. Over the next week, it kept happening. Some nights I wouldn't see him. Other nights I'd peek through the curtain just a crack, and there he'd be, standing in almost the exact same spot, facing my window like a shadow carved into the night. He never waved, never moved, never said a word, just stood there, as if watching me was enough. I started losing sleep. I'd lie awake, listening for sounds outside, waiting for him to appear, and the more it happened, the more one terrifying thought sank in. If I could see him so clearly from my window, that meant he could see me too. A few nights later, things went from unsettling to terrifying. I had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV still playing in the background. At around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. Not because of a sound, but because of that same heavy feeling, that invisible pressure of being watched. My chest tightened as I sat up, the flickering light of the TV casting faint shadows across the room. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. My curtains were closed, but a thin line of light peeked through where they didn't fully overlap. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved across the gap, not fast, not accidental. Someone was there. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I leaned forward just slightly, careful not to make noise, and the shadow moved again. Closer this time. Too close. I knew it was him, my neighbor. He wasn't just standing across the courtyard anymore. He was right outside my window. Asterisk. I couldn't move. My whole body went stiff as the shadow lingered just outside the curtain. For a moment, I told myself it could be a trick of the light, maybe a tree branch swaying in the wind. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it clearly. The outline of a man, broad shoulders, a head tilted slightly, like he was leaning closer. He was only feet away, separated from me by nothing but a thin sheet of glass and fabric. My breathing grew shallow. I sank lower on the couch, praying he couldn't see me through the gap. The TV screen flickered behind me, and I realized with dread that it was casting enough light to silhouette my body against the curtain. That's when I saw him shift, just a little, enough to let me know he was aware. He knew I was there. I wanted to grab my phone. I wanted to call someone, but I was paralyzed, trapped in that awful silence, where every second feels like an hour. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, the shadow was gone. Asterisk. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat there on the couch, staring at the window, waiting for him to come back. Every sound outside, every creak of the building, every car passing on the road made me flinch. When the first light of morning finally crept into the room, I worked up the courage to pull the curtain open. The courtyard was empty, no sign of him. For a moment, I almost convinced myself it had been a nightmare, that maybe exhaustion had blurred the line between dream and reality. But then I noticed something. On the glass of my window, faint, almost invisible in the daylight, were smudges. Fingerprints. 4 of them, pressed against the corner of the pane, right at eye level. My stomach dropped. He had been there. Not across the courtyard, not somewhere in the shadows. He had been right outside, close enough to press his hand against my window, while I sat just a few feet away inside. I stepped back from the glass, my whole body trembling. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't a bad dream. He really had been watching me. Asterisk. That night I couldn't relax. I closed every curtain in the apartment, double-checked the locks on my doors, and even shoved a chair up against the front door like that would somehow help. But no matter what I did, the fear sat heavy in my chest. I kept replaying those fingerprints in my head over and over. He had been that close, watching me, touching the glass like he owned it. Around midnight, exhaustion finally pulled me into a light sleep, but less than an hour later, I woke up to a sound, a faint tapping. I froze in bed, straining my ears. At first I thought it might be the heater, or maybe the pipes rattling, but then it came again, sharper this time. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. I sat up, my heart hammering, and stared at the curtains. The tapping stopped. Silence filled the room. Then, just as I started to think maybe it was in my head, a shadow moved across the fabric. Slow, deliberate. Someone was there again. I didn't need to look. I knew who it was. My neighbor. Asterisk. I stayed frozen, staring at the window, praying the sound wouldn't come again. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then, the tapping started once more. Not faint this time. Louder, more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. It was him, and he wanted me to know it. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands, ready to call the police, but then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. It was muffled through the glass, low and rasping, but I could make out the words. I see you. I dropped my phone onto the blanket, my whole body locked in place. My neighbor wasn't just watching anymore. He was trying to communicate, to let me know that he was aware of every second I spent in that apartment. I sat there in the dark, too terrified to move, while his shadow lingered against the curtain. Then, as if satisfied, he finally stepped away. But even after he was gone, I couldn't stop shaking, because those words wouldn't leave my head. I see you. Asterisk. The second his shadow disappeared, I scrambled for my phone again. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hit the buttons, but I managed to dial 911. When the operator answered, I poured out everything. The fingerprints, the tapping, the whisper. My voice cracked as I told her he was right outside my window. Within minutes, 2 officers arrived. I didn't even wait for them to knock. I opened the door and let them in, begging them to check around the building. They walked the perimeter with flashlights, scanned the courtyard, even shined lights into the stairwells. But of course, by then, he was gone. One of the officers pulled me aside and lowered his voice. "Look," he said, "unless we catch him in the act, there's not much we can do. If you see him again, try to get it on camera. Proof goes a long way." Proof, that's what it came down to. They left me with a case number and a hollow reassurance that they'd keep an eye on things. But when the red and blue lights faded down the street, I was left standing alone in my apartment, and I realized something that made my stomach turn. He lived right across the courtyard. It wasn't like some stranger lurking outside. He could walk back at any time, slip into the shadows, and the police would never know. He was close. Too close, and I was completely on my own. Asterisk. That night, I couldn't stop replaying the officer's words in my head. Get it on camera. Proof. That was the only way anyone would believe me, so I set up my phone near the window. I angled it just enough to capture the curtain and the faint line of light that leaked through the middle. Then I hit record, turned off the TV, and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, waiting. The minutes crawled by. My eyes grew heavy, but the fear kept me awake. Around 2 in the morning, it happened. A shadow crossed the gap. My heart leapt into my throat as I watched the fabric move ever so slightly, like someone's hand was brushing against it. The tapping started again, soft at first, then harder. I stayed frozen, but my phone kept recording. I thought this was it. This was the proof I needed. And then I heard it, that same rasping whisper, clearer this time, pressing through the glass like ice water down my spine. "Why are you hiding?" I clapped a hand over my mouth to stop myself from making a sound. The shadow lingered for what felt like forever before it finally pulled away. When I worked up the courage to check the recording the next morning, my blood ran cold. The video was grainy in the dark, but it showed the shadow moving, and then a pale hand pressing flat against the curtain, the fingers spreading wide. Proof, the kind I never wanted to see. The next morning, I didn't go straight to work. I sat at my kitchen table with the video playing over and over again, my hands shaking every time I paused on the frame that showed his hand pressed against the curtain. There was no denying it now. I had proof, but proof of what? That my neighbor was outside my window in the middle of the night. It was enough to terrify me, but would it be enough for anyone else to care? That thought ate away at me all day. When I finally left the apartment, I couldn't stop my eyes from drifting across the courtyard. His blinds were closed, his balcony empty. But even in daylight, I felt like he was there, watching, waiting. Later that afternoon, I saw him. I was coming up the stairs with groceries when his door opened. He stepped out onto his landing like nothing was wrong. Casual, calm, like he hadn't been outside my window whispering to me hours before. He didn't smile. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me. That stare lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like he was peeling away every layer of me. Like he knew I wasn't going to say anything. Like he was daring me to. I rushed into my apartment, locked the door, and stood with my back against it, gasping for breath. That was the first time it hit me. He wasn't just some creep lurking around at night. He was playing a game, and I was the only one who didn't know the rules. Asterisk. By the time night came, I felt like a prisoner in my own apartment. I kept every light off, hoping maybe he wouldn't notice if it looked like I wasn't home. But the silence made it worse. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the fridge sounded like a warning. Around 1 in the morning, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was sharper this time, more aggressive, like he was testing me. My throat went dry. I sat frozen on the edge of the bed, staring at the curtains, knowing exactly what I'd see if I looked. Then came the whisper, not muffled this time, louder, clearer, right against the glass. "Why won't you let me in?" The words chilled me to the core. My chest tightened so much it hurt. My hand trembled as I reached for my phone, but before I could even unlock it, the curtain shifted. Fingers, pale, thin fingers curled around the edge of the fabric, pulling it back just an inch. Enough for him to see me, enough for me to see him. And there he was, my neighbor's face, blank, expressionless, his eyes fixed on me through the narrow gap. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other in silence. I couldn't scream, I couldn't move. It felt like my body had shut down completely. Then, just as suddenly, he let go. The curtain fell back into place, and the tapping stopped. Asterisk. The second the curtain fell back into place, my body finally caught up to the fear. My chest tightened. My breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, and I doubled over, clutching my knees as if I could hold myself together. It felt like my heart was going to tear out of my chest. I wanted to scream, to run out the door and pound on a neighbor's wall, to do something, but I couldn't. My voice was gone, strangled by the sheer terror of what had just happened. For nearly an hour, I sat there in the dark, shaking, staring at the window, waiting for the tapping to come back. But it didn't. He was gone. When the sun finally rose, I still hadn't slept. My hands shook as I made coffee, every shadow in the room making me flinch. My phone sat on the table, and I hovered over the number for the police more than once. But what would I even say this time? That my neighbor had pulled my curtain back to look at me, that he whispered to me through the glass like he belonged inside my home. Without hard evidence, it would just be my word against his. And deep down, I knew he knew that. That's what terrified me the most. He wasn't careless. He was confident. By the time I finally left for work, one thought circled in my mind, over and over. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a certainty. He was going to come back. Asterisk. That afternoon, I tried to convince myself that maybe I was safe in the daylight. The sun poured into the courtyard. Kids played outside. And for a brief moment, it almost felt normal again. Almost. But then I saw him. I was locking my door on my way to work when his blinds slid open, just a little, enough for me to see him standing there, his face in shadow, his body perfectly still. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched as I fumbled with my keys, pretending not to notice. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I kept my eyes down, walked faster than usual, and practically ran to my car. The entire drive, I couldn't shake the thought that he was still at that window, watching me leave, memorizing the exact time I was gone, calculating when I'd come back. When I returned home that evening, the blinds were closed again, the balcony empty. It was as if he hadn't been there at all. But that's what made it worse, because it meant he was waiting, watching from the shadows, biding his time. And I knew when the sun went down, the real nightmare would start all over again. Asterisk. By the time the sun went down, I felt like I was preparing for war. I checked every lock twice, shoved a chair under the doorknob, and kept my phone charged and ready with the camera app open. I told myself I'd stay awake this time, that if he came back, I'd be ready. But nothing could have prepared me for how bold he became. It was just after 2 a.m. when the first sound came. Not tapping this time, but a slow, deliberate scrape across the glass, like a fingernail dragging from one edge of the window to the other. The noise made my stomach twist. I turned off my phone's flashlight and pressed record in the dark. My hands trembled so violently, I almost dropped it. Then the whisper came again, low and steady, closer than ever before. "I like watching you sleep." My blood ran cold. My chest tightened. I wasn't even in bed. I was sitting upright, wide awake. He didn't just know I was there. He wanted me to know. The curtain shifted. the fabric tugging inward like a hand was pressing against it. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't pull it back again. But then came something worse, the unmistakable sound of the window lock being tested. Asterisk. The faint rattle of the window lock made every muscle in my body seize. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was trying to get in. I shot to my feet, clutching my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. My first thought was to scream, to make as much noise as possible, but the fear strangled my throat. All I could manage was a shaky whisper to the 911 operator as I dialed with trembling fingers. "He's here. He's at my window, please. He's trying to get inside." The dispatcher's calm voice on the other end felt a million miles away. She told me to stay quiet, to lock myself in another room if I could. But I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the window as the sound grew louder, the soft click of the lock being jostled over and over, patient and deliberate. Then the whisper came again, clearer than ever. "Let me in, just for a little while." My stomach lurched. The voice wasn't angry. It wasn't even threatening. It was calm, gentle, like a friend asking for a favor, and somehow that made it even worse. As the dispatcher assured me officers were on the way, I backed into the hallway, my phone trembling in my hand, praying the glass would hold just a little longer. And then, silence. The lock stopped rattling. The curtain went still. The shadow was gone. Asterisk. Minutes felt like hours as I crouched in the hallway, clutching the phone to my ear. Every nerve in my body was on fire, waiting for the sound of glass shattering. But it never came. When the knock finally came at my door, I nearly screamed. It was the police. 2 officers swept through the apartment with flashlights, checking every corner, then circled the building outside. I stayed frozen near the doorway, still trembling, while their radios crackled with quiet static. When one of them finally returned, his expression told me everything. They hadn't found him again. But then he motioned for me to follow him to the outside of my window. He shined his light low across the frame, and that's when I saw it. The metal around the lock was scratched, fresh, the paint chipped where something sharp had been dragged back and forth. My stomach twisted. He really had been trying to force his way in. The officer sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, we'll write this up, but until he actually breaks in, there's not much else we can do. You might want to think about staying somewhere else for a while." Staying somewhere else, as if it were that easy, as if I could just pick up my life and leave overnight. When the officers finally left, I was alone again. The apartment felt smaller than ever, the walls closing in around me. And the worst part wasn't what had happened. It was the sinking realization that he wasn't going to stop. Asterisk. After the officers left, I sat in the middle of my apartment with every light on, staring at the scratches on my window. I couldn't stop thinking about how close he'd been, inches away from slipping inside. That morning, instead of going to work, I went straight to a hardware store. I bought a cheap security bar for the sliding window, motion lights for the courtyard-facing wall, and even a baseball bat I kept propped against my bed. It wasn't much, but it gave me the illusion of safety. I also dug out an old webcam I hadn't used in years and rigged it to my laptop, pointing it at the window. If the police wanted proof, I'd give them proof, but none of it eased the dread. Every sound still made me jump. Every shadow in the hallway felt like him, slipping through cracks I hadn't covered. And then, as I was screwing the lock bar into place, I made the mistake of glancing across the courtyard. His blinds were half open, and there he was, standing perfectly still, framed in the gap, watching me hammer the bar into the window. I froze, the screwdriver shaking in my hand. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He just stood there, silent, his face unreadable. It was like he wanted me to know. No matter what defenses I built, he was already inside my life. Asterisk. That night, I sat awake with the baseball bat across my lap. The glow of the laptop screen dimmed as the webcam recorded every second. I told myself the new lock bar and motion lights would keep him away, that maybe, finally, I'd scared him off. But around 2:30 a.m., the light outside my window flicked on. Something had triggered the motion sensor. I leaned forward, my breath caught in my throat. The camera was rolling, but I couldn't stop myself from peeking through the tiniest gap in the curtain. And there he was, my neighbor, standing just beyond the glow of the light, his face half hidden in shadow, his body still as stone. The light clicked off after a minute, leaving him swallowed in the dark, but I knew he was still there. A moment later, the sound started. Not tapping this time, not rattling the lock, but slow, deliberate scratches against the glass, as if he was dragging a key across the surface, testing it, mocking my new defenses. The bar held, the lock didn't budge, but he didn't need to break in to terrify me. He just needed me to know he could try, whenever he wanted. I sat there, gripping the bat so tightly my hands went numb, whispering to myself that the glass would hold. But in the back of my mind, one thought kept eating at me. Glass can shatter. Asterisk. The scratching finally stopped around 4 in the morning. I sat there in silence, gripping the bat until the sun started to rise, too afraid to move until I was sure he was gone. When daylight finally filled the room, I rushed to my laptop and played back the recording from the night before. And there it was, clear as day, in the grainy glow of the motion light. My neighbor, standing inches from my window, his face tilted upward, staring directly inside. At one point he leaned closer, pressing his palm flat against the glass, smearing it across like he was feeling for a weakness. The sight made my stomach twist. It wasn't just the image of him standing there. It was the look in his eyes, cold, patient, like he wasn't breaking in because he didn't need to rush. I froze the frame and stared at it, bile rising in my throat. It was proof, the kind of evidence the police had been asking for. But instead of making me feel safe, it made everything worse, because now I knew exactly what I'd been trying not to admit all along. He wasn't just watching me for fun. He was waiting. Asterisk. The moment I had the files saved, I drove straight to the police station. I didn't even bother calling first. I needed someone to see this with their own eyes. Sitting across from the officer at the desk, I slid my laptop forward and pressed play. The video flickered to life, showing my neighbor in the harsh glow of the motion light. His face, his hand pressed flat against my window, his eyes locked inside my apartment. For the first time, the officer didn't look skeptical. He leaned closer, his brows knitting together as the recording played. "That's him?" he asked. "Yes," I said, my voice shaking. "That's my neighbor. He lives right across the courtyard. He's been doing this for weeks." The officer sighed, scratching something down on his notepad. "This is good evidence. We can file a restraining order, maybe have a patrol swing by more often. But until he actually forces entry or makes a direct threat in person." His words trailed off, but I didn't need him to finish. I knew exactly what he meant. They still couldn't stop him. I left the station with a piece of paper, a case number, a promise that my report was on file. It felt like nothing. As I pulled back into the complex, I glanced across the courtyard. His blinds were open again, and he was there, standing in the window, watching my car roll in, like he already knew where I'd been, like he wanted me to understand. No paper, no police, no patrols would ever keep him away. Asterisk. That night, I didn't even bother pretending I could sleep. I sat in the dark with the bat by my side, the laptop recording. Every nerve in my body wound so tight I thought I might snap. For hours, nothing happened. The courtyard was still, silent, almost peaceful. I started to think maybe he wouldn't come back, that maybe the police visit had finally scared him off. But then, just after 3, I heard it. Not tapping, not scratching. Breathing. Slow, heavy breaths against the glass. I froze, my chest locked tight as the curtain shifted inward with every exhale. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He was close enough that his breath fogged the glass. My phone shook in my hand as I hit record, but I couldn't bring myself to move closer. The sound of that breathing filled the room, steady and patient, like he had all the time in the world. And then, for the first time, he spoke without whispering. His voice was low, clear, and terrifyingly calm. "You look different when you're awake." I nearly dropped the phone. My whole body went numb. Every thought in my head scrambled by those words. When I finally dared to pull the curtain back just an inch, my blood ran cold. He wasn't standing across the courtyard anymore. He was crouched directly beneath my window, his face tilted upward, grinning at me through the glass. Asterisk. The sight of his face through the glass ripped every ounce of air from my lungs. His grin was too wide, too deliberate, like he was enjoying every second of my fear. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the bed, my phone slipping from my hand onto the floor. The thud echoed in the silence, and his grin only widened. For a moment, he didn't move. He just crouched there, his eyes locked on mine, fogging the glass with every breath. Then he lifted a single finger and dragged it slowly across the pane, a long, screeching line, like he was tracing the barrier between us. I couldn't breathe. My heart hammered so violently it felt like it was shaking the walls. I wanted to scream, to run, to call someone, but all I could do was stand there, frozen, as it pressed his forehead against the glass. The sound of it was wet, deliberate, and then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he leaned back. His grin faded into the dark. His shadow melted away into the courtyard. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I stood there in the silence, staring at that window, waiting for him to return. He didn't, but the smeared outline of his forehead, pressed into the glass, stayed long after the sun came up. Asterisk. When morning finally came, I felt like I hadn't taken a single breath all night. My legs were stiff, my throat raw, and my eyes burned from staring at that same spot on the window for hours. The first thing I saw in the daylight made my stomach twist. The smear. A faint oval where his forehead had pressed into the glass. The condensation dried but still visible. Proof that he hadn't been some nightmare vision. He'd been there, inches from me, smiling. I scrubbed the glass with shaking hands, but it didn't matter. The mark was burned into my mind. By noon, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and drove to a friend's place across town. I didn't tell them the full story. I just said I needed a place to crash for the night. They gave me a couch, a blanket, and a confused look, but they didn't ask questions. And for the first time in weeks, I thought maybe I'd sleep. But when I closed my eyes that night, in a completely different apartment, miles away from my own, I couldn't shake the image of him crouched beneath my window, because deep down, I knew moving for one night wasn't enough. He was still there, waiting, watching, counting the hours until I came back. Asterisk. The next evening, I forced myself to go back. As much as I wanted to stay away forever, I couldn't just abandon everything I owned. My lease, my belongings. My life was still there. But the second I stepped into my apartment, I knew something was wrong. The air felt different, heavy, like someone had been there while I was gone. I dropped my bag and walked slowly through the rooms, my heart pounding against my ribs. Everything looked the same at first. The curtains closed, the lights off, the bat still propped against the bed. But then I noticed the smell, a faint trace of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. My neighbor smoked constantly on his balcony. I'd smelled it 100 times drifting through the courtyard. But this wasn't outside. This was inside. My chest tightened as I stepped closer to the window, and that's when I saw it. The curtain. Someone had pulled it back just slightly. Not all the way, not obvious, just enough for there to be a thin gap, like a careful hand had tested it. I backed away, trembling, every nerve screaming at me to leave, because in that moment, one horrifying truth settled in my mind. He hadn't just been outside anymore. He'd been inside. Asterisk. As I stood frozen in the middle of the room, staring at that slight gap in the curtain. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the bat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of that apartment and never come back. But another part of me needed to know. If he'd been inside once, was he still here? I forced myself to move, one shaky step at a time. First, the bathroom. Empty. I yanked the shower curtain back so hard it nearly tore. Nothing. Then the kitchen. I flung open every cabinet door, my breath coming in sharp bursts. Still nothing. Finally, the bedroom closet. The door was cracked open just slightly, the way I never left it. My stomach dropped. I gripped the bat tighter, every muscle coiled, and shoved the door wide open. My heart almost exploded out of my chest, but the closet was empty. Still, the fear didn't leave, because even though I searched every corner of that apartment, every shadow, every hiding place, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was in the silence, in the air itself, like he was still there, tucked just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the hallway with the bat across my lap, staring at the window until my eyes burned, and I swore I could hear it, faint, almost inaudible, a laugh somewhere in the walls, or in my head, I couldn't tell which. Asterisk. It was after 3 in the morning when I heard it again. At first I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, the faint creak of footsteps outside. But then came the sound I feared most, the slow, deliberate scrape of a finger across the glass. I gripped the bat so hard my palms ached, staring at the curtain. The scrape came again, louder this time, dragging from one end of the window to the other. And then his voice. "You shouldn't have left." The words froze my blood. My chest tightened as I tried to steady my breathing. He knew I had gone. He had seen me leave, maybe even followed me. The curtain trembled as a hand pressed against it, pushing the fabric inward. I backed into the hallway, phone in one hand, bat in the other, whispering into the 911 call as quietly as I could. But before I could even explain, the sound changed. The rattle of the window lock, harder this time, more forceful. The dispatcher was asking me questions, her voice calm and steady, but I couldn't answer. All I could do was stare as the lock shook violently, the glass shuddering in its frame. And then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. Silence. The curtain swayed gently, like it had been released, and in that silence, his whisper returned one last time. "You can't hide from me." By the time the officers arrived, the courtyard was empty again. Asterisk. When the officers left again, I didn't even bother pretending to feel reassured. Their flashlights had swept the courtyard. Their radios crackled, but I knew the truth. He was never going to be caught like that. He was too careful, too patient. I sat in the middle of my apartment, shaking, staring at the window until the sun started bleeding through the curtains. My whole body felt hollow, like fear had carved me out from the inside. That was when the decision finally hit me. I couldn't stay here. It didn't matter that I had a lease, or that my belongings were scattered through every room. It didn't matter that the police had a file with my case number in it. None of it meant anything. Because as long as I stayed in that apartment, I wasn't living. I was waiting for the night he finally pushed hard enough on that lock, waiting for the night the glass finally gave way, waiting for the night I woke up and he was standing inside. I packed what I could into 2 bags, clothes, my laptop, a few essentials. I didn't care about the rest. As I zipped the last bag shut, I glanced toward the window one final time, and for the first time in weeks, the blinds across the courtyard were closed. But somehow that was worse, because it meant I couldn't see him anymore, and I had no way of knowing if he was still there, watching me leave. Asterisk. I carried the bags down the stairs with trembling hands, every creak of the steps sounding like a gunshot in the silence of dawn. My car sat at the edge of the lot, bathed in the pale morning light, and for the first time in weeks, I thought I might actually be free. But halfway across the courtyard, I felt it, that weight, that pressure, the one I'd grown to know too well. Someone was watching. I forced myself not to look, not to slow down, but my eyes betrayed me. Just for a second, I glanced back toward his apartment, and there he was. His blinds were no longer closed. He stood at the window, perfectly still, his face half hidden in shadow, watching. Always watching. Our eyes met for one last moment. My chest clenched, my legs weak, but I forced myself into the car and drove. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I left behind the apartment, the furniture, the life I thought I had. But his presence followed me, because even now, years later, I still wake up some nights with that same heavy feeling, that same pressure pressing down on me, pulling me toward the window. And sometimes, when I finally work up the courage to look, I swear I see him, a shadow, a figure, standing across the street, waiting, watching, like he always has, like he always will. Asterisk.